Broadcasting live from the Business Radio X studios in Atlanta, Georgia, it's time for CEO Exclusive, brought to you by Anona Enterprises.
Good morning and welcome to CEO Exclusive, where we get emerging trends from CEOs and their most trusted advisors. I'm your host, Soyini Koch. And today I wanted to share with you a little afterthought or reaction from somebody that I spoke to about last week's article. So as you recall, last week, I posited and threw out a framework for potentially achieving full adoption of conscious capitalism and conscious business principles. So just to back up, as you know, on CEO Exclusive, we've been talking about conscious capitalism now for almost 2 years. And in that conversation, I've heard many times, many people say, well, it would be really great if all capitalism took on this shape and this form, where the business leaders are conscious of their impact on their employees, all the stakeholder communities that they touch. They're very conscious about culture, and they have a defined and driving higher purpose. That's kind of the shape and the pillars that underlie conscious capitalism principles. And it would be really great. I've heard many people say, me included, it would be really great if all business looked like that. So in last week's article, I posited, well, that's not going to happen by accident. So how could it possibly happen that the market achieves full adoption of conscious business principles, meaning that either all businesses or some overwhelming majority of businesses are kind of conforming to these principles? And the roadmap included, 5 different things. And I'll just recap those for those of you who didn't read the article, and a good review for those of you who did. So the first thing I suggest is that we who are interested in conscious business refine and define what it is that we want business owners to do. So I firmly believe that we got to keep it simple. And if you want somebody to do something, you actually have to tell them what it is that you want them to do. And while Raj and John Mackey have created this beautiful work and this beautiful body of literature, I think that there is more work to be done about defining conscious capitalism down to the point where it's a set of specific behaviors that business leaders in particular can understand whether or not they're doing or not doing those specific behaviors. So that's the first thing, refine and define what it is we want people to do. The second is to then build awareness. So we have an idea of what we want people to do. Now we need to make people aware of that. And I think a lot of work is being done in the awareness arena. There's, John Mackey's been on Oprah, certainly the Conscious Capitalism National Organization is working really hard on building awareness. There are chapters all over the country and all over the world. And, there's been writing and people are talking about it and blah, blah. So I think awareness is where a lot of the activity is. The third thing, though, is once we make everybody aware of conscious business and they're clear about what it is that it is and what we want people to do, the third is to actually spur and drive adoption. And for me, I make the distinction of adoption as taking meaningful action. I think that if somebody just signs a pledge, I don't know for me whether or not that really constitutes adoption of conscious business principles. I think that we need to see some meaningful commitment of time, resources, mind share. And as we get better at defining what we want people to do, then we will get better at defining what adoption really looks like, because we'll know whether or not people are doing it. So adoption would be the third thing. Then once we have adoption, then we have the next, which is creating an infrastructure or an ecosystem that supports people in growing. Once they've made the commitment and they've started on the journey, then there needs to be a set of services and support to have people continue to grow in this direction. And I think that there's, a lot of work being done there. I mean, there's B Lab and B Corp and Grow Beyond Profit and this, growing ecosystem of consultants and supporters who can help businesses once they've decided that they want to adopt conscious business principles to get better and do it with increasing levels of skill. And then the final, which I don't know that I even mentioned in the article, sorry, is then once people adopt and they've developed some proficiency in their having their own stories of success is to then begin to advocate. So I think that creates this flywheel or this cycle that then will spur increasing levels of adoption. That's just a recap of last week's article. But what happened is I actually had a conversation with someone in reaction to the article about whether or not the need to define and refine contest capitalism is real, whether or not we need metrics, whether or not we really need to define the behaviors. And I jokingly say that there's a contingent of people who believe that contest capitalism is just, in people's hearts, and that the goodwill of leaders is sufficient to drive contest capitalism. And, as I mentioned in the article, and many of you have heard a number of times, I continue to talk about and advocate the importance of metrics. And so what I want to kind of posit and discuss further in, my conversation with you today is this notion of the limits of goodwill and the limits of modeling for conscious leadership. So there's a principle that you may have heard before. It's called Dunbar's principle, but it's this idea that business leaders or any individual human can only hold but so many close relationships. And some people call it pseudoscience, but there was an anthropologist who studied the size of primates' brains. And, for better or for worse, human beings are primates. We're, trapped in these primate bodies and, trapped in the neurology of primates. And what this anthropologist determined or believes is that based on the size of the primate's brain and the neurology, there's only a certain amount of relationships, close relationships, that one person can hold. And that number was found to be between 100 and 250. And colloquially, most people just use the number 150, that one person could only hold and remember and have about 150 close relationships. And so if you think about that and you apply that inside of a business that's trying to adopt conscious capitalism, I think this idea that there's only a certain amount of relationships, close relationships that one person can hold is part of the reason why I tend to believe that having metrics and behaviors and infrastructure that is separate from the leader's behavior, that is separate from leadership, that's independent of leadership behavior, is so critical. Because I even had this conversation at a conference last year where I was asking somebody else about the importance of, kind of codifying these things. And he said, for my business, it's pretty small. Like, I can reach out and I can literally touch everybody. I know everybody's name. And once you get past that point, though, once you get to having more than 150 people, certainly you can say, well, then your direct reports, then you have a set of people that are underneath the leader who then can expand their set of relationships. And maybe you can tend to drive it that way. But once you get past the number of individual relationships that one person can actually have, I think that's the point at which I continue to believe that having systems and processes and divorcing these principles from the individual goodwill of the leader becomes really critical. So just to kind of give you an example. So you have a business leader, a CEO, and she has her company that has 150 people in it. And she can go out and she can have these conversations and talk about conscious culture and model the behaviors. And every single person in that business, because she has this network of close relationships, is going to see and, kind of adopt. Because, if we're talking about primates, monkey see, monkey do, right? So yes, she can model those behaviors for those 150 people. But once you get to like 300 people and you get to, 450 people, or you get to 4,500 people, it becomes exponentially more difficult for the values that CEO is trying to model to get down to the 4,500 and first person. And even if you think about transferring those values to the second level or the third level of middle management, it's kind of like a game of telephone, which you may remember from school. It's like it gets increasingly more diluted as you go further and further down in the organization. So this is, for me, the case for another version of the case for why having these principles clearly delineated in a way that's not tied to personality, it is just, it is, I think, the way that conscious capitalism is going to scale. And so, that's the thing that I wanted to really talk about and elucidate for you all today. So then what does that look like if we have these metrics, and how would it work? So we can have the CEO continuing to model her behavior, but then in parallel with that, and to bolster and strengthen that, if she has a clearly defined set of behaviors that are non-ambiguous and can be measured, she can then use that to make sure that she's scaling to the second and third level of management in her organization. So I think that's it for us today. This is CEO Exclusive. I'm your host, Soyini Koch. I hope you have a prosperous, productive, and very profitable week. Thanks.
This show is brought to you by Anona Enterprises, where strategy is your access to money and performance. Learn more at AnonaEnterprises.com.